to do it that way. All right. So do we need to do like a sound check? That sounds so kind of neat.
You are good.
Okay.
All right, anytime.
Okay. All right. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to everyone for coming. I'm author Eileen Schnabel, and my new book is Kep Westguard, Rebel Spy, and my first book is One If by Land, Two If by Submarine. It's an entire series about a time travel series about kids going to the American Revolution. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why I wrote this. And does anyone actually here, I will ask, know any veterans? Who do you know?
Well, just some of my coworkers, and actually one of my brother-in-laws is a veteran. I was like, oh,
And what arm of the service?
Air Force.
Very good, very good. Well, that plays a role in how I ended up writing the series because my grandpa is a World War II veteran, and he served in the U.S. Navy in the South Pacific, and that's his ship that my aunt tracked down. And those are some of the letters he wrote me during college. And that stuck with me a lot, this sacrifice that people made for our country through the service. And that was in the back of my mind growing up. Also, my dad was in the service. He was, that's my dad, and he was in the Airborne. And he served part of his time in at the Berlin Wall. And one story he used to share with me was that on the other side of the wall in East Berlin, there would always be two soldiers. It was, and on his side there was only one. And so he asked his sergeant once, "Why are there two soldiers on their side and one on ours?" And the sergeant said, "That's because it's an East German and a Russian, and they're actually under orders to shoot each other if either one makes a break for freedom." And on this side, there was not a concern of making a break for freedom. And that idea, again, of the importance of freedom, sacrifice, stuck with me kind of in my heart growing up. So the next thing I was curious is if you could pick one time event or place that you personally in the United States, a historical event, where would you travel to? Just ask where you would go. Where would you go?
Probably the Lincoln's second inaugural address.
And why for that?
Just because it was an inflection point of our country, and just after the Civil War, he wanted to bring everyone together.
A very important time, yes. And then similarly, one other question is if you could meet one famous historic American, I'm just curious who you would meet. Who would you meet? Only one. If you could only pick one, and invite them to dinner and just learn a little bit about history.
It would be like President General Ulysses S. Grant, because it was just like because the Civil War was pretty complicated and like all the reasons why. So from his perspective,
for sure. And one of the fun things about writing history is you get to meet, and I'll put in quotes, a lot of historic characters. And these are a few in my first book. That was Phyllis Wheatley, who was an amazing story. She was actually a poet in the United States, even though she had been sold into slavery at the age of 7. And she had an incredibly difficult life and became extremely, extremely successful as a poet. This is in the 1700s, this is during the Revolutionary War, and was invited by General George Washington to come and meet with him during the Revolutionary War. She was an amazing woman. That's John Hancock, Prince Hall, British General Gage, and does anyone know who on the horse would be? That would be Paul Revere, which is what the theme of of my first story is. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Battle of Saratoga and why it's so important to the Revolution, because that's the theme of the second book here. This is the first book. Kep and his 4 teammates go to take Paul Revere's ride. They have to save the American Revolution from a villain who is trying to undo the win of the Americans and have the British win. And in the second, he goes back to the Battle of Saratoga because that was an amazing turning point in our country's history. The reason it was a turning point is because it finally brought the French in on our side. And what a lot of people don't realize is America wouldn't have won the Revolutionary War without the help of France. We needed both guns, we needed ships, we needed a navy, and France was the one who provided it. But prior to the Battle of Saratoga, they wouldn't help us because they were worried about essentially backing the underdog. And if we lost, they would be in a worse situation, having given a lot of funds to the losing side. This is a little bit similar. One of the fun things about American history is you can start to see overlays with current events and past events. And right now, I'll ask anybody know what's the war going on in Europe right now? The Ukrainian War. And can you think of anything that the Ukrainians are asking for that would be similar to some of the things the United States was asking for from our allies?
Like equipment and all the battle stuff.
Exactly.
Guns and-
Yeah, that is exactly right. Basically, as you said, battle equipment, guns, money is what they're, so you start to see these parallels in history, and that would be something that's parallel to what was happening for us. So for Burgoyne, he had an actual great plan here. This was the original plan. Burgoyne was going to end the American Revolution, put the rebels in their place. He was going to start in Canada, march down. He had a second general that was going to come in from the west. General Howe was going to come up from the south. This was all Burgoyne's plan. They're going to meet in Albany, and they're going to cut the colonies in half. So what happens is, it's a great plan. He thinks everything's going to win, but something goes wrong. And I'll just ask real quick what you think could go wrong for Burgoyne. Anybody got an idea what could go wrong? Weather, excellent, and that was a problem. It was actually rainy, and coming down came harder than they expected. Anything else? Get attacked along the way, and that happened. The Americans knew they were coming down, so they would cut down trees to slow their route. They would send raiding parties to shoot at them. So everything got slow, and then it went from bad to worse because St. Ledger, if you remember, that was one of the, oops, I'm just going back. St. Ledger, he's supposed to be coming through. He gets stopped. This is a Battle of Oriskany, and he is stopped on a 21-day siege at Fort Stanwix. Sorry, I don't know why that keeps flipping over there, but we'll leave that. And so he doesn't end up coming. General Howe, who is supposed to be coming up from the south, decides of his own accord that instead of meeting Burgoyne, he's going to take over Philadelphia. And that was another problem with the American Revolution, with the Revolutionary War under the British side, is there wasn't a clear chain of command for this plan. So people could go along with it, could opt out. And in this case, Howe just opted out and didn't come to Burgoyne's aid. So between the two, he doesn't have anyone coming to help him. Taking a step back real quick to the Battle of Oriskany, which, as I said, was what kept St. Ledger from coming. This was a big part of American history because, does everyone know about the Iroquois League? Anyone know what the Iroquois League was?
I remember learning about it in high school, but I can't
Okay.
quite remember.
So it was a group of Native American tribes in the United States that agreed to a no aggression contract that they would not fight amongst each other, and that helped them a lot. However, in the Battle of Oriskany, some of them, the Oneida in particular, allied themselves with the American cause, and some of the other troops allied themselves with the British cause. And so it was the first time in American history where that League of Nations fought, the Iroquois League fought amongst themselves. And in Native American history, this is considered a very sad place and a very sad battle because it caused the breakup of the Iroquois. So Burgoyne now is pretty much going to be fighting solo because St. Ledger's not coming and Howe is not coming. Meanwhile, General Gates, actually things are went from bad to good because of another big event in American history. He was going to meet, like we said, he knew very well that Burgoyne's coming down, and he's going to try to stop him. So his goal is to stop Burgoyne. But the problem is, in his camp, he's losing people all the time. People are deserting. They're worried. This is fall. This is September and October. They need to get harvest in. And people that were supposed to renew their contracts don't want to renew their contracts, so people are just leaving, and his numbers are diminishing. And Burgoyne, which I forgot to mention, is coming down with 8,000 soldiers. So he needs a big force to meet them, and his force is actually dissipating. But a big thing happens in American history that changes that, and it's the murder of a woman, actually. And this is the murder of Jane McCrea. And this is a famous painting. Does anyone know about Jane McCrea? Okay, so this was a sad event, first of all, obviously sad. She was killed, and she was killed by soldiers under Burgoyne. But what the Americans did is they used it as a huge propaganda event. They said this was one isolated incident, and there were both women, children, and men on both sides being killed by raiding parties. It's just this one event, kind of like the Tea Party, is going to be taken and blown up across America. And what they said was, the Americans said, Burgoyne is sending his troops down, and if you care about your sisters, your daughters, your wives, you're going to stand against him, because otherwise you'll be killed by the British and the British soldiers. And what was extra helpful to the American side was the fact that a lot of Americans were on the fence. They didn't know, they didn't really care that much, frankly. They were just living their lives, like most of us. They don't care, do the British win, do the Americans win? We don't really care that much. Well, for the fence sitters, what makes a big difference here too is she was engaged to one of Burgoyne's officers. So he was saying if they can't, the Americans were saying, if he can't even control his raiding parties, this was with Native Americans, but there were American raiding non-Native American raiding parties as well. There's all kinds of raiding parties. And if he's not protecting even a loyalist, then this is what's coming for you. So as a result, Americans are, colonists, excuse me, who were maybe on the fence, are flooding into Burgoyne's camp to essentially save their families. Now this created a difficult situation for Burgoyne because he's trying to negotiate with his Native American tribes that are his allies, and it created a fallout. This one incident created a big fallout. And as a result, most of his Native American scouts and troops left, which hurt him a lot because they were excellent soldiers, they were excellent scouts, they knew the topography. Now they're gone. So now he doesn't have St. Ledger coming, he doesn't have Howe coming, and his Native American allies are gone. He's in a pretty tough situation, which only got worse. One more worse thing before the actual battle. He is short on supplies because if you think back that long march down from Montreal all the way down to Albany, he didn't really plan how long it would take, and he was low on food, and his men are actually on half rations at this point. They have very little food, and he doesn't have horses. Some of his mounted cavalry are actually walking instead of on horses. So he hears of this place called Bennington, and it's near his camp, and he thinks, I'm just going to go raid Bennington, I'm going to get food, I'm going to get supplies, I'm going to get guns, I'm going to get horses, it's all going to be good because it's not protected very well. Unbeknownst to poor Burgoyne, the word gets out, and John Stark, who becomes an American hero, rounds up a bunch of colonists and says, let's go face them head on. And as a result, the Americans win this battle, this smaller battle, and Burgoyne loses over 1,000 men, killed, captured, and wounded. And that's a big hit to Burgoyne. So not only does he not have his soldiers, but he's also lost all his hopes for supplies, which makes it kind of interesting that he does actually end up winning the first Battle of Saratoga. So Saratoga is two battles close together. There's the Battle of Freeman's Farm and the Battle of Bemis Heights. This is the Battle of Freeman's Farm, and Burgoyne does win it, but it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory because he wins the field, but he loses a lot of men. So he's kind of ahead, but the Americans start to realize we could win all of this. This could be a game changer. And it does. So shortly thereafter, because of all the reasons we talked about, Burgoyne goes up one more time against him in the Battle of Bemis Heights, and this time he loses. And this is a big, big thing that really changes world events, because it's the first time ever in the history that Britain has surrendered an entire army. This has never happened in British history. And that's the reason, going back to the beginning of our talk, that France says, wow, the British actually gave up a essentially 8,000 soldier army. You know what? The Americans may win this. And that changed everything. And then they flooded us with supplies. And then, of course, we end up winning the American Revolution. So this is why, for this particular book, for Kep Westguard, I placed it at the Battle of Saratoga and put it between those two famous battles, between the Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights, when American history could have gone either way. And Kep, who's a 13-year-old time traveler, has to find out what is Burgoyne's plan, how is he going to win the second battle, because throughout the series there is a villain, and the villain wants to change the outcome of the American Revolution. So the villain can also time travel, and he goes back and he says, I'd like the Americans to win this time. And let me ask if you can think of any reason, because that was, as a writer, I had to have a reason that my villain wants to change the outcome. Like, why would somebody spend all this time traveling to change the outcome? So you have any thoughts? Like, why would somebody, who maybe, would actually want the Americans to lose the American Revolution?
His ancestors could have been loyalists.
If your ancestors were loyalists. And where that actually came up, because I was racking my brain, how am I going to motivate my villain? And it turns out there are, to this day, lawsuits by loyalists that can trace their ancestors to loyalists. Because what happened is when the Americans won, They went to the Loyalists and confiscated their wealth, their lands. A lot of them had to flee for their lives up to Canada. And there are, to this day, people suing the American government saying that you basically took my heritage. And so that is what Kep, each time he goes back in time, he's facing this villain who wants to change the outcome. Well, to make it extra complicated, Kep and his brother Max are Americans, and it is their grandfather who wants to change the outcome. So it creates a very difficult family dynamic. So in this case, he is a spy. And I'll just tell you just really briefly, this is the finishing up here about some of the history, because it was fun to do the research. I wondered in Saratoga, General Burgoyne, the famous General Burgoyne, what would his living quarters have been like? So I actually contacted the Saratoga National Park, which is an amazing park where you can actually go and walk through all of this history. And I contacted the park rangers and I said, I know that this is what General Washington lived in, and this was found, it was actually at a library, I think. Yeah, it was amazing. They found the actual plans for General Washington's marquee, and it was a huge find. And no one had known prior to that or remembered what his living quarters would have been like. So I contacted the Saratoga National Park, and I said, well, was that similar? And they said, yes, it would be very similar. So this is, when I wrote the story, I was able to know about how General Burgoyne would have lived. So when Kep meets with Burgoyne on his spy mission, he has a sense of what the situation is like. There are a lot of books on Saratoga because it is a turning point. So I got to read enormous numbers of books and enjoyed them. And then lastly, if none of you, have anyone gone to a historical reenactment? No, they're wonderful. So there's a big one every year in Illinois, which reenacts the American Revolution, and it's parts of it, obviously, and that's wonderful. So I'd recommend if you ever go to a historic reenactment, to see living history is a wonderful situation. So I wanted to say thank you for taking this time with me today to learn a little bit about American history. I have a lot more information on my website and a lot more resources. And I also want to say that if you learn to love history, you will never be bored. I really believe that because it's unending, the numbers of fun things to learn. And lastly, the best place to start would always be your local library to find a lot of great things. So thank you for your time today. And I really enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you. All right, cue applause, thank you. All right, that was hard to do. You guys, thank you for being here, both Kelly and Josiah and Greg. Yeah, it's a really interesting, this part of American history is just, there's so many layers to it, and so many, I think it's almost like I always say, it's a little bit like, like a Star Wars movie, the characters and the situations and the motivations,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just I definitely learned stuff.
Yeah.
Quick talking. And then just with the historical research you have to do and all that stuff.
Yeah.
It's like, a lot of you guys just again.
Yeah, it was really fun. Yeah, and thanks for being here, and thank you, Greg. Thank you.